thank you to Ancestry for supporting PBS. I desired liberty. For liberty I gasped. For liberty I uttered a prayer. It seemed scattered on the wind, then faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed a humbler supplication for change, stimulus. Me during the quarantine. Romping about the moor with your star-crossed jerk boyfriend when all the signs, be they supernatural or mundane, have gathered to tell you that this romance is, kinda messy, sis. Plus, spooky manners and constantly roaring winds. We must be in the Bronte zone. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte was there for the weird girls, the quiet ones who watched and listened, the ones who pined away for someone to accept them in all of their weird, dark, Doc Martin glory. But in the nearly 175 years since its publication, the collective definition of what it means to be a woman on the outside of society has changed and expanded dramatically, as it should. And yet here we are, still dissecting Charlotte Bronte's words and gravitating towards Jane as a protagonist. For those of you who have never read Jane Eyre or enjoyed one of the 8,000 films, television, stage, or media adaptations, not to mention the countless literary retellings, I mean, so many, let's get into it. Written and published in 1847 under the pen name Currer Bell, call back a previous video, I was in it, check it out. Jane Eyre concerns the life story of a titular heroine from childhood up until her mid-20s, the only years that really matter for a woman. Jane, an orphan child, is left to the care of her wealthy but highly abusive aunt and cousins who verbally, emotionally, and physically torment her to the point where any self-defense is labeled as her acting out. She is sent away to an austere boarding school for girls, not even in the fun way, where the headmaster is equally abusive and cruel, watching as her fellow classmates are all punished, near starved, and in the case of her best friend there, left to die from infectious disease. Several years later, after reaching adulthood, Jane leaps at the opportunity to see more of the world when she takes a governess position at the totally creepy mansion, Thornfield Hall, which is owned by the curmudgeonly Edward Rochester. From there on, the story splits into two paths. I'm totally in love with this jerk-faced boss who lies to me and plays mind games with me because I'm the help and completely below his station romance. And wait, why do I hear creepy laughing and footsteps every single night? And wow, who is setting beds on fire? Gothic fiction. The two genres women are absolutely the best at. Who can lie? Spoiler alert, it's Mr. Rochester's mentally ill wife, Bertha! Hi, Bertha! Say hi, Bertha! Also, spoiler alert, Jane doesn't find out about Bertha until seconds before she almost marries Mr. Rochester. Real keeper of a guy, but we can fix him. Will Jane and Mr. Rochester's dark, torrid romance finally be realized? Will Jane find the self-love and confidence to stand up for herself? Wait. He locked a woman in an attic. Like, this is a romantic lead? While immensely popular and beloved today, having sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the last 50 years alone, and translated into dozens of languages, including Esperanto, okay? Flex. It is perhaps for the best that Eyre was published under a pseudonym, as critics were eager to rip it into shreds for its comparatively dark, moody heroine and content. Said contemporary critic and historian Elizabeth Lady Eastlake of the book, "We do not hesitate to say that the tone of mind and thought, which has overthrown authority and violated every code human and divine abroad, and fostered Chartism and rebellion at home, is the same which has also written Jane Eyre." Wow. Tell us what you really think of it. But where Jane Eyre becomes important is its place in the tradition of the Bildungsroman, or simply a novel about a person's formative years. While Jane Eyre is not the first novel told from a lower middle class woman's point of view, it is the first noticeable Bildungsroman that has one as its main subject. It is also told in the first person, putting the reader directly into her thoughts and forming worldview across the years. The idea of the self is a priority in the text, since Jane isn't guided by heroics, but what she thinks is good for her and what will keep her alive. Towards the end of the book, Jane is presented with the opportunity to be a good, middle-class English woman when the stuffy, self-righteous Minister St. John proposes to her and promises to take her with him to India as a missionary? Serious colonization vibes there. But at the last minute, Jane takes a look at him and says, nah, I'm gonna go back to the crazy philandering lying bag of hammers that is Mr. Rochester. I mean, he's Byronic, don't you think? Again, callback. I was in that video. Have you watched it? You should. Says Professor of Literature Sharon Losey, in this respect, Jane Eyre is atypical in its appropriation of the male pattern of development for its protagonist. Jane's story begins, as theirs do, in her childhood when she is 10. Female protagonists of the courtship novels mentioned above rarely ever leave home, or do so only within the prescribed orbits of young women preparing to marry. Jane Eyre, on the other hand, moves through the world like a boy. But if we're going to talk about Jane Eyre, Rochester, and what this book has meant for feminist literature, then we need to talk about Bertha, Rochester's wife that he kept in the attic for over a decade because women be crazy. Bertha is the trope namer of the term madwoman in the attic. Authors in the 19th century were confined to make women either angels or monsters, and in that binary we have Jane and Bertha. In their foundational criticism, The Madwoman in the Attic, authors Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar defined this binary between the two women as the main confrontation of the novel, calling it a secret dialogue of self and soul, on whose outcome we shall see the novel's plot, Rochester's fate, and Jane's coming of age all depend. Bertha, in other words, is Jane's truest and darkest double, the angry aspect of the orphan child, the ferocious secret self Jane has been trying to repress ever since her days at Gateshead. Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre is the evil ghost-like woman who haunts Thornfield Hall, only seen through the perspective of Rochester, who views her as a toxic beauty. I thought I loved her. Her relatives encouraged me. Competitors piqued me. She allured me. A marriage was achieved almost before I knew where I was. Oh, I have no respect for myself when I think of that act. I never loved. I never esteemed. I did not even know her. Alexa, play the world's smallest violin. Rochester sees himself as a victim of the Mason family, who didn't tell him about Bertha's mental state, and when she started to deteriorate, Rochester locked her in the house for 10 years, which I'm sure 100% had no side effects on her mental health whatsoever, and we're supposed to root for this guy. Bertha stands in the way of Jane and Rochester because Rochester never divorced her, and so he would be a bigamist if he married Jane, which is bad. While Bertha's race is and can be assumed to be white, there is an implication of otherness in how he compares Jane to Bertha due to Bertha being Creole, a white person raised in the West Indies. She's got a little too much seasoning for Rochester's English palate, if you get my drift. When relating why he was picked by the Masons, Rochester says, "Her family wished to secure me because I was of a good race, and so did she." This could have many implications, including that Bertha's family may have, somewhere down the line, mixed with the black population and were no longer perceived as fully white. As Susan L. Meyer, professor of English at Wellesley College, explains, an interpretation of the significance of the British Empire in Jane Eyre must begin by making sense of Bertha Mason Rochester, the mad, drunken West Indian wife who Rochester keeps locked up on the 3rd floor of his ancestral mansion. Bertha is killed in the burning of Thornfield Hall, which she does. That also leaves Rochester blind. She jumps to her death, freeing herself from imprisonment. Which, honestly, good for her in the end. How sympathetic Bertha was supposed to be in the 19th century is a little hard to understand, since she is such a haunting figure in the novel. But in a post-colonial sense, Bertha is utterly tragic, especially because Rochester basically says, it wasn't me, in terms of taking any accountability for the situation that caused them to be married. Like, grow up, dude. You're an adult. Hence why we need to go to the greatest way readers can examine text. Fan fiction with White Sargasso Sea. Written by white Dominica author Jane Eyre, White Sargasso Sea is a response to Jane Eyre, which tells Bertha's story. Bertha becomes Antoinette Causeway, an heiress in Jamaica, and her story is broken into 3 parts that discuss her childhood, marriage to a nameless Englishman, and then her fate in England as a captive. In part 1, we see Antoinette's childhood on a sugar plantation that has gone belly up since slavery was abolished. Yay! Suck it! Antoinette's mother attempts to marry another different wealthy Englishman in order to fix their money problems. Hearing this through the grapevine, the freed slaves end up burning down the plantation, which results in Antoinette's brother passing away and exacerbating all the mental health issues that already exist within the family. One of the most iconic scenes of the book is when Antoinette goes to a black Jamaican girl named Tia to try to escape the reality of her burning home during this small revolt. As I ran, I thought, I will live with Tia, and I will be like her. When I was close, I saw the jagged stone in her hand, but I did not see her throw it. I did not feel it either, only something wet running down my face. I looked at her, and I saw her face crumple up as she began to cry. We stared at each other. Blood on my face, tears on her. It was as if I saw myself, like in a looking glass. The character of Tia is a foil for Bertha as a black girl of the same age. During the fire, Bertha, Antoinette, goes to Tia and Tia throws a rock at her because despite Antoinette thinking they are the same, Tia knows that she is the daughter of freed slaves, just in the same way the English Jane is a perfect example of white superiority over Bertha and her tainted, implied otherness. In part 2, Rochester complains a lot about being in the Caribbean. I hated the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the rain. I hated the sunsets of whatever color. I hated its beauty and its magic, and the secret I would never know. I hated its indifference and the cruelty which was part of its loveliness. Above all, I hated her, for she belonged to the magic and the loveliness. She had left me thirsty, and all my life would be thirst and longing for what I had lost before I found it. Can someone get this man a La Croix? It's too hot. It's got too many bugs. Man, I miss England and my under-seasoned food. Also, I don't care or respect my wife's mental illness, so I'm gonna mess around, rub it in her face because she may be crazy, but I'm a man, so Does it show that I'm not a fan of Rochester? Is my bias showing? What we see in Rochester, or this nameless man in this passage, is a man who feels unable to deal with things he cannot control, and what he cannot control, he loathes. A sentiment that does not seem so far off from the man we meet in Jane Eyre. Finally, in part 3, Antoinette's transformation into Bertha is complete. She has lost all sense of time, as would you if you were stuck in an attic for 10 years by your husband. There is no looking glass here. And I don't know what I'm like now. I remember watching myself brush my hair and how my eyes looked back at me. The girl I saw was myself, yet not quite myself. Long ago when I was a child and very lonely, I tried to kiss her, but the glass was between us, hard, cold, and misted over with my breath. Now they have taken everything away. What am I doing in this place? And who am I? Literary theorist Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak explains, in the figure of Antoinette, who Rochester violently renames Bertha, Eyre suggests that so intimate a thing as personal and human identity might be determined by the politics of imperialism. Antoinette, as a white Creole child growing up at the time of emancipation in Jamaica, is caught between the English imperialist and the black native. In this fictive England, she must play out her role, act out of the transformation of herself into that fictive other, set fire to the house and kill herself, so that Jane Eyre can become the feminist, individualist heroine of British fiction. White Sargasso Sea is Exhibit A about how fan fiction and metatextual examinations can have real literary value when copyright doesn't get in the way. It doesn't make Jane Eyre a weaker book, but highlights things that Bronte would not have been aware of. Bronte talks about the realities of poor working women and does great work of giving sad, awkward brunettes a true heroine. But then you get Bertha, a mentally ill woman who has been put into a horrific situation by her husband. And the book goes, Jane, what am I? Responsible for actually getting to know the woman I'm gonna marry? This is the 19th century. She's lucky I'm rich and white. That's why she even gets to live in the attic of a mansion. She could just be living in the attic of a townhouse. That would be tragic. In perhaps one of the most famous lines from the novel, Jane, thinking Mr. Rochester is going to marry a woman of society, cries out to her star-crossed lover, "Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You are wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are." Jane Eyre, the novel's plea to the humanity of women of the lower station, is both its greatest staying power and one of its most glaring weaknesses, and how it manages to advocate for acceptance while still creating an other in Bertha, who is not extended the same sort of compassion. In many ways, Bertha is a foil to Helen Burns, Jane's childhood friend who dies young and is a perfect Christian. Bertha is all of the women that were seen as impure in their race, impure in their mental health, and dangerous because of both. It is racist and ableist Victorian BS, and it has made Bertha a legend, and her burning Rochester's house is one of literature's best good for her moments. And really, all of this is over a man who literally dresses in racist drag so he can manipulate two women in hopes of making Jane jealous? Justice for Bertha. And honestly, good for Jane for at least waiting until she secured her own bag to get her Byronic husband. Because sadly, viewer, she married him. Thank you to Ancestry for supporting PBS. Was that your great-grandmother keeping the family together? Was that your great-grandfather paving the way for change? Did they brave Mother Nature and walk away stronger? Did they face the unknown with resolve and triumph? There is strength in every family story. Ancestry can help you learn about yours. Visit Ancestry.com for more information.